Hey, I figured I'd stop in. Oh, we're live already. I didn't notice that. Well, I guess they're busy doing their own thing, I suppose. Nope, I am. Yeah. Well, I mean, this question is interesting, and let's see. I mean, why should morals be? Actually, no. I mean, are morals even objective? Because I mean, there are places where they seem to have different values and morals. Well, what's the difference, though? Well, I mean, yeah, well, morals is morals is how you treat people. Values is, yeah. But I suppose you could value morality, or you could value how to treat people. Well, no, obviously, but they can be a guide on how to treat people. Yeah.
I couldn't actually hear you in the video, but
Chihuahua, hello.
yeah, maybe I should refresh it.
Are you sure you don't just have the stream muted?
No, I mean I was just watching the video.
Wonder where Steve is.
No, I mean I could hear everybody else. I just couldn't hear you. I don't know. But yeah, that could have just been me.
So I've been talking to myself. That's okay. I do that all the time anyway. People think I'm insane already, so it's fine. Ouch! Excuse me.
So while he's doing that midnight, what's your perspective on this?
I don't know. Personally, I don't think you need God to have morals, but that's just me.
You don't think what?
I don't think you need God to have morals, but that's just me.
I mean, I pretty much agree, but there's one issue. So, like, what do you think morals are?
Well,
Like,
I mean,
what do you like? Are you like a subjectivist or?
I don't know. I'm just somebody who likes to learn, man. I don't know where I stand on anything. uh,
Okay. Yeah, so my thing is, so I think that morality is what you have to do in order, what you ought to do in order to be happy, basically.
okay,
Because
shouldn't we distinguish between should and ought? I mean, isn't that the big contention between people?
I
Like
don't
the
think there's a real.
like those two words. Like I've heard this before. There people have said ought or should. Like I don't know. I might be misremembering, but
I don't think there's a real distinction there. I think maybe some people try to make that distinction because so the thing is Hume made the argument that there's an is-ought gap, right? But I don't buy that because I think that you can say if you want this, then you should do this, basically, or you ought to do this. They're basically synonymous. But the issue is, so you could argue that we'll take 99.9% of the time for you might not want to kill people or go and rob a bank because you're probably not going to end up so great after that, right? But then if there's no like ultimate judge or ultimate judge who's going to make sure that you're going to end up less happy if you rob a bank, then you could end up excuse me, you could end up more happy by robbing a bank. And in that case, is it moral to do that under
well, okay.
atheism?
Why are you robbing a bank in the first place? Is it greed, or or are you robbing a bank because your family member is sick? And and you need a shit ton of money in order for them to survive. If it's greed, that's that's looked down upon more harshly. If the guy if the guy is robbing a bank because of a sick family member, yeah, okay, he'll still get in trouble, but but he may be looked at, he may be judged less harshly than the guy who's doing it for greed. Like life is black and white. Hold on, let me rephrase. I'm, life isn't black and white. Jesus. Uh, life isn't black and white. There are shades of gray, and this is why it's important to analyze situations. That's why I love philosophy. I went on a tangent there, but sorry.
Well, Thaddeus would not agree with that if he could speak. But yeah,
Hey,
but
that's okay.
it's about whether or not you what if so objective morality is about whether or not you ought to do something, and that applies to everybody, not necessarily regardless of circumstances, but given the same circumstances. So like I assume you would say, so like the common position is killing babies is always wrong, right? Would you agree with that?
Well, okay, but hold on. Is the baby healthy? That's the question you gotta ask.
Well, I would say it doesn't matter, but
Well, no, okay. Look,
let's say that it is.
don't try to spin this in something like political correctness. Yes, it's always wrong to kill babies, but we never consider other stuff. I don't know. What a tough question.
So you think there could be cases where it's okay to kill babies?
Hey, wait, can you guys hear me?
Well, I can. You'll have to check on the video.
I wonder, because what I basically did is I had the Hangout thing running, and then I just basically switched to my phone.
Yeah,
So
I would think it would work. Yeah.
yeah, so hopefully people can hear me now. So I guess I'll just have to mod with the computer and talk with the phone, unless I want to restart it all over again, which I kind of don't want to do. So
So Thaddeus, it's your hangout. What do you want to talk about?
That is the hangout. But whatever's going on right now, the whole, the exact. You guys were fine going on before. I just wanted to make sure people could hear me because I'm the moderator, right? So this is a really backwards way of making sure this happens.
Yeah. So what's your opinion? Should we kill babies?
No.
Well, Midnight doesn't seem so sure.
These, yeah, okay. See, these questions are just wow. I asked a question if the baby's healthy, and this is where we go.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Why do we have to go back to killing babies, though? Why can't it be? You always choose some of the most messed up examples when it comes to morality, man. I'm telling you.
Well, it's because atheists these days. No, I'm kidding.
Wow. The atheists these days are always killing. No, I was kidding. Yeah, I know what you mean, though.
Well, if you don't choose the most extreme example, you never know if somebody's actually going to be like, well, I don't know, maybe that is moral.
Yeah, I guess so.
Can I get another agnostic or atheist in here?
Well, you could. You could. Hang on. No. You could if someone actually wanted to come in. I can't force people to. That's the thing. So yeah, you definitely could, though. No, but as far as the whole morality thing, I honestly feel like there really is only one, like, objective morality, and that would be whatever God says goes because it's His universe. That's kind of the thing I was going to try to make. If it wasn't apparent already.
Well, why?
Yeah, it is apparent.
Why should that matter?
I mean, why should that matter? I mean, it's His universe, so
Well,
He probably made things set up in such a way that, that these things are right and wrong, kind of just by definition of those things.
but so like, if we're in a country, right, where there's a king, and he basically owns everything,
Right.
I don't think it follows that whatever he says is the right thing to do.
Right, but that's a king of a country. There's a difference between somebody who created the entire universe, like the laws of physics and all that stuff. King didn't create the laws of physics and how that works.
Why is there a difference? He's considered a king among kings, isn't he?
Yeah, but he's not just a king among kings. He's also created the entire laws of all the physics and all that stuff, dude.
Well, I ultimately agree with you, but in a different way. So.
So it's like if everything was set up a certain way, so it's supposed to function this way, then that makes sense that's why it's right and wrong. Because for some things that maybe there's a certain, what do you call it? I guess optimal state that certain humans whatever are supposed to be in. And maybe by following rules whatever you'll be in this optimal state, but not everybody will necessarily want the optimal state. That's the problem.
Yeah, and we send those people to hell.
Right. Exactly.
And and apparently that's fine. That is completely fine.
Why wouldn't you want to be in the optimal state? Like maybe.
What is it? What is this optimal state? It's like,
well, it's whatever God decides, according to Thaddeus.
Well, where is this God?
Well, that's a different question. But yeah, I don't know. My thing is, so I kind of agree with Thaddeus. So God ultimately set up everything so that.
Yeah, but how do you know He set up everything?
Well, that's a different question, right? Like that's a question of whether God exists. Like I think we're assuming here that God does exist, right?
Well, you are. I'm not.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, hey, the conversation can't continue if you're going to be like that. Well, I mean, I guess it could, but it'd be weird.
It would be a different topic. It'd be whether God
Right.
exists.
Yeah, but that's what it always evolves into. I know that's supposed to be the question of the great debate, and maybe do something a little different. Come on, we can be more creative like that.
Yeah. So I was just saying that the idea is that God created everything in a particular way, such that if we, behave in a certain way, according to God, whatever God decides, pretty much, then we'll be happy. That's the basic idea.
Okay, and what does God decide?
Well, I think that God decides for us to act according to human nature, because I think that human nature is ultimately God directing us to act in certain ways, basically. So like for example, whenever human beings have a drive to reproduce, right? I think that that's comes from the will of God.
Is taking shit
Okay.
from the will of God too?
Say what?
Nothing.
Yeah, I would say to the whole I guess the optimum state or whatever. It's like everything is set up in such a precise way that again, the optimum state doesn't necessarily mean it's something that humans will like or even enjoy per se, but everything's kind of set up for you to kind of run your life in a very way. And there'll be certain caveats or whatever for not doing things that way. Some of the consequences for doing some of these quote unquote sins can be kind of obvious. It does feel very cynically contrived that way. Maybe you disagree, but
Well, I mean, I think that the way that God created us, it was so that whenever we actually obey what He says, we will be more happy. I think that God ultimately wills the good for us because that's He has to, since God is good.
right. Well, I hear what you mean. It's but I don't know. That just goes back to the whole thing about whether why would God even let sin in that in the first place? Which I don't really want to go down, but I hear what you're talking about.
Man, I'm surprised more people aren't in here.
Yeah, I know. It's weird. I'm not quite sure what's going on. Maybe Dragnaut's hosting something. I don't know about it. Because he usually gets a lot of viewers for basically doing nothing.
Well, all you gotta do is complain about G-Man, right?
Right, exactly. That's way more interesting than the actual topics that I thought the great debate community was centered around.
When is that debate between them? Is that tomorrow?
Who knows? I don't keep up with it. But anyways, answer some of the live chat things that I don't want them to feel left out. You're not just sitting here for nothing. There was something back up I kind of wanted to address, if I can find it here. Nah, I don't see it anymore. If somebody else has something interesting, then yeah, say it. But yeah. So a lot of people actually missed what my points in the beginning because apparently there was no audio for the beginning part of this hangout. So that's kind of funny for somebody who's just watching it over. It's like this got this many views and what? There's only no audio or nothing. But yeah. Wow, how do you view the whole objective morality thing then if you don't quite view it the same way as me, despite us both technically being theists, despite us not both being Christian?
Well, so you know how things tend to act in a certain way, right?
Right.
So things tend to act for an end or for a specific purpose, if you want to call it that.
All right.
So the idea is that God ultimately has to will. So that's also the idea is that things can't do that by themselves. the idea is that God, in creating things, he directs them towards those ends because he has to create things for a purpose since he has a will, right? And the ultimate purpose that he creates things for is for himself. It's right, because and he himself is the good. It's what we're ultimately created for, right? So whenever we're talking about desires, which is where we get our happiness from when we fulfill our desires, right? They're ultimately directed towards something in particular. And since God creates us with our desires, he specifically creates it for an end inside of God himself.
Right.
So all that morality is ultimately is what we have to do to achieve union with God. And in which case we will achieve complete happiness, since that's ultimately what our desires are directed towards.
So I guess with all these different, I guess the only thing I'd say is what? I guess maybe it was designed for a specific purpose, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people use it for that purpose, like those desires or whatnot.
Yeah. Well, yeah, people can, instead of trying to achieve union with God, they could try to, I don't know, do drugs instead or something, right?
Right.
Yeah. So people ultimately, when they're not going for God, they're going for some finite good instead of the ultimate good.
Right. That's why I no longer like to call subjective morality subjective morality. I mean, I might if it's just talking to somebody outside of these circles, but here in this community, whatnot, I've learned better than that. I just call it subjective values, because everybody has their own kind of values about what they find more important. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the morality, though.
Yeah. But you can see why I think that that's ultimately misled. I think that people are ultimately mistaken if they think that they would be happier if they say, did drugs instead. Because I think that ultimately,
Well, drugs are destructive.
well, yeah, or whatever you want. Do you think that whatever finite good you think is better? I think they must ultimately be mistaken, because I think God created our desires with an end inside of himself.
Okay, here's a good chat comment. These are the type of comments I love to address. So in the live chat, George says, God is good. Has anyone in the Hangout ever read the Bible? God's a homicidal psychopath. Where is the good that Christians keep insisting is there? And as a non-Christian, I'm probably just going to agree with him. So, but you, what do you exactly?
Okay, so when the Bible says, when I say God is good, I don't mean that his actions, I don't mean that everything that he does is good. I don't think that God's goodness depends upon his actions.
Right.
God is good means that he is goodness itself. So basically, since he's what everything is directed towards as their final end, right? That makes him good. Since it's ultimately what will fulfill our desires and make us happy, that's what makes God good. It's not. It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not he does things that are we would consider moral on earth, because that's not really applicable to God.
Right. So it's like something that goes beyond all the things. Like it's so out there that no one's gonna really be able to quite grasp what it is.
Yeah, and if you think about it, God's goodness couldn't depend upon other things because God's the first cause. And if God's goodness depended upon other things, that would mean that we were a cause of God's goodness, which would be contrary to God being the first cause.
Right. So would you also say the whole goodness of God or whatnot? I mean, people, I guess, judging it from the outside, that's just more based on their opinion.
Yeah.
So you can't really do that.
I think that
as far as calling somebody good or not.
Yeah, I think that it's people applying a human standard to God, right? Because they're thinking of God as being, ultimately all of the mistakes that atheists make these days, I think, is based upon the idea that God is just some glorified human being. And so they apply human standards of morality to God, where that doesn't really apply, in my opinion.
Right, he's a deity, dude. Yeah. So it's a little different.
Exactly.
Right. Now, I mean, George is kind of maybe not so much in the whole evil or whatever thing, but I mean, he's kind of right. God did actions that some people could look down and say that's pretty messed up, but I mean, for you to actually call it good or bad, I mean, again, that's where it goes into the whole how do you define morality here? So in a way, this kind of conversation helps nip the bud, and by saying you can only really have objective morality with God. So if God is good, by definition, then there's really nothing you could say on the morality front.
Yeah.
You can point to the actions and stuff, sure. I mean, even I do. But I'm not going to be as silly as to call it good or evil.
Yeah, he's just saying, I don't like it. Okay.
Right. That's what I do too. Right.
Yeah. Just because you don't like something doesn't mean that it's not good, right? There's a lot of things that people don't like. People don't like working out, but yeah, it's actually good for you.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes when it comes to morality things, sure, feelings might matter for your values, but they don't necessarily matter for actual morality. And as we're discovering right now, there's an existence. I mean, what am I saying? Right now, there's a difference. So Bob in the live chat says, God is good and God's evil. God is all things because nothing is created but through God. So that's an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. But there's, I think it's making a slight mistake.
What do you think the mistake is?
So he's right in the sense that everything. So I would say everything is good insofar as it has existence. But the issue, and so the issue is whenever things lack some form of existence that they ought to have, basically. So when it comes to what has to be the cause of good, it ultimately has to be something that exists. So the cause of evil ultimately has to be good. Now, as for whether or not God is the cause of evil, I think that he is in a secondary way. He's the cause of evil in the sense that he creates things that have the capacity to create evil. I don't think he creates evil directly. He creates things like, humans with free will, or things with the capacity of becoming corrupted. And that's where we get the idea of evil from. I think directly, that's not what God is creating or willing, because God's ultimately willing himself in creating the universe.
And here's like a very blatant misrepresentation of what we're saying. He also says, people don't like being set on fire. Is that good for you? But, those kind of comments are expected and not even necessarily condemned. Because after all, us humans are emotional creatures first before we are logical ones. At least in general.
Yeah, that's why politics are so crazy. But we
can't
do that.
Right? No, we can't do that. That's against the rules, Ouchie. Can't do that. And so I mean, with the whole evil thing, though, because someone like Bob again says that evil didn't create itself. Do you view that somehow that God is still responsible in a way for evil, because if he made everything? How do you get around that? I know that's kind of a conversation for another hangout, but
that's fine. I think we should go into these things.
Yeah.
So, like I said, I think that God creates things willing that they have a particular end, right? So that's how I went into it before. So God would create humans willing that they ultimately end inside of God as their end, right?
Okay.
But he also gives them the ability not to do that. And although he's willing that we end up, you know, coming in union with God, with himself, humans can go against that.
Right.
So it's not that God is. So God creates the possibility for us to do evil and for evil to exist, but he doesn't will that in itself. What he's willing is the good in itself, and it just happens as an effect of that there is evil. So I mean, if you think about it, it's like, you know, if you do everything right in like raising your children, right, and then they still end up going down the wrong path, are you really responsible for that? I mean, you raised your children, but they have free will and they can go against that, right?
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. I mean,
yeah, because technically you created your children, right? So if you didn't create your children, then they couldn't have. And this would be kind of the argument they make with God. If you didn't have children, then they couldn't have done evil. But that's not. I don't think that's really your fault if you're doing everything right.
Interesting. Right. Yeah, so Brother John in the live chat actually says, allowing for the opportunity of evil is willing it. And like I see where you're coming from though, but we're not quite talking about a human though. We're talking about a God who should be beyond all that, right? Like he should be able to create a being where that kind of thing doesn't even have the possibility of even happening.
Yeah.
Humans have very limited control over how their offspring is going to act.
Right. No, I agree. God didn't have to create things that are corruptible or things that have free will. But if he didn't, then there would be a lot less good in the world as well. So, you know, the classic example that I've heard is that if the lamb didn't die, then there wouldn't be a lion that exists. So there's many things that would not exist which are good if we didn't have evil. And so, although God is, you know, allowing for that evil, he's not willing that in itself. He's willing these other good things that come out of that evil.
And those goods are like so necessary.
Well, they don't have to be necessary.
Right.
I don't think, you know, God's not bound to create the best possible world. I don't think that.
Right.
I think
think that either. Obviously.
I think all God has to do is will the good as at the end.
So if people do want to join the hangout, all you have to really do is just message me at Thaddeus Trill, because there are some people. There's one person that wanted a link, and you just have to message me on Google Plus, and I can send you a join link. I have a weird setup going on now because I had some audio problems, which is why I'm using my phone, despite me being in the hangout also with my computer on the Great Debate Community Hangout at the same time. But I can still see the live chat because I'm still close to my computer. It just gets a little confusing sometimes. But yeah.
Yeah, so you probably think opposite of what I think. Or I guess you probably agree with me a lot.
I agree with you, yeah, quite a bit. The only thing I'd say is I don't think any of this is necessary, and I do think that on other things that I feel like you're giving God a little too much credit.
What do you mean?
Well, no, you're saying that, it has to be this way or not because I look how like it's beyond our ways or whatnot, but not necessarily.
Well, no, I don't think that. I don't think that it has to be this way. I think that God decided to make it this way, and I think that he can do that in willing some greater good than the evil that exists. But I don't think that he had to create the world this way. Yeah, because I don't think that, like I said before, I don't think God is bound to make things perfect. I don't think that God's bound to make the world the best possible world. I think that God can do whatever he wants as long as he's willing the good as the end, himself as the end.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. So I sent Bob, who was in the live chat, a join link. He's been in the community before. I think he might have a few objections and make things a little more interesting in here, because both of us in here are pretty much yes men on a lot of the same things. So there we go. Bob has joined the call. I'm going to broadcast. And I'm also going to broadcast what's his face, MP. I'm going to let Bob go first because I think he's been wanting to get in here for a while. Bob, what exactly do you want to say about this subject?
Oh, I mean, it's just some of the things that, you know, Ochoa was saying. It's like he won't accept that God could be evil at all. That that God is, you know, like morality wise.
No. Hang on though. With the whole term of evil, though, I mean, we already discussed how we can't really use those terms good or evil because who are we to call them good or evil?
Well, I mean, we have to have a discussion, right? I mean, otherwise we might as well just say God is God and not have a discussion at all. No matter what happens, it's just God, and move on. And why bother talking about it?
What do you mean by evil, though? That might help.
Well, I mean, just basically whatever people, we're talking like morality, right? What's good and bad, right, wrong, good and evil. It's just like a generic term. I really couldn't describe exactly what I consider evil.
Yeah, I would say that's the problem.
You got to remember, though, with the whole good and evil thing. Usually when it comes to these conversations, it doesn't actually help to use good and evil in a colloquial sense, because it doesn't actually describe too much about what exactly you feel should be right or wrong. That's why it's more about...
Doesn't the Bible pretty much describe it as anything that goes against God's laws and commandments?
Exactly.
Is evil.
And that's a more formal definition of evil when we're talking about morality. Yeah, so you could still use evil or good in the slang terms that we like to use in everyday lives, but that's not really what good and evil are.
Well, basically, that's what I'm talking about. Anything that goes against God's laws or commandments.
Okay. So if you're using it in that sense, then God can't really be evil, because how can he go against himself?
It's a little hard to describe evil, because one thing is that evil is really described as the opposite of good. It's just like light and dark. If someone said, well, describe light, you would generally want to point to darkness to kind of show the contrast. And I think that's kind of the folly that we want to try and just say, what is evil? Evil is, honestly, what is not good. If you're just defining God as good, but if you're, how are you guys defining good, and how are you guys defining evil, where you don't have that counterbalance?
Well, good is what God really desires for how his universe to operate.
So no matter what pain or suffering occurs, that's good.
He can use them like the bad stuff or whatever, or things that we think are not so good for.
Well, he doesn't.
That sentence doesn't make sense.
Hang on, MP, hang on. I don't understand why you said God uses the bad stuff, right? Let's go back to the beginning. There was nothing before God. There was nothing, not a single thing before God, right? God created everything. God created everything out of his breath. So God created anything that we consider evil. God created anything. God created the things that go against the things he wants, because they didn't create themselves. They didn't pop out of thin air, because everything that is comes from God. So to say that, well, God allows these things and God uses these things that happen, they weren't there before God created it. So I don't understand why people keep using God lets them happen. God uses those things. They weren't there before God created those things.
But he didn't create. But he didn't directly create those things, though.
No, he did. They didn't create themselves.
He directly created the devil. He directly created the devil.
No, but hang on.
Yeah.
He did not create those things. Did not create themselves. They created themselves. Then your God is not the creator of all things. He's only the creator of some things.
You have to remember that we are theistic evolutionists, so we accept the theory of evolution. We're not young Earth creationists.
And I'm not a Christian.
Evolution has nothing to do with it. Evolution is just God using the things he created and guiding them in a certain way.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know how evolution came into the topic.
Yeah, I mean,
whatever God, whatever exists, God created.
Yeah.
And in a sense, that's right, because nothing would exist without God sustaining them in existence.
Right.
So I think that, but whenever God, say, wills that a lion eats a lamb, right? He's not willing that the lamb dies. He's willing that the lion is sustained. So that's how I would see it. So he is willing the good in allowing the evil and allowing the evil to happen as a result of that.
Well, he created the consequence of when the lion eats the lamb. He knows the lamb's going to die,
right?
And go through suffering before it dies. So for you to say, well, God just created, for the lion to have sustenance and not accept that he also created for the lamb to suffer and die is ridiculous.
Right. And your point is exactly what?
My point is just that so if God is willing the good of the lion, he's not willing the bad of the lamb. In fact, since God also creates the nature of a lamb, he's necessarily willing the good of the lamb as well.
Yeah, but see, even in that situation, if you're applying this model to God, there's nothing about that situation that is evil. Everything is good because everything beholds itself to the will of God. God allows all things to happen. If God can do no evil, then you are defining God as God is good and everything that occurs is good. There is no evil in this paradigm.
Well, hang on. I want to say
because God.
Hang on. No, he's not doing it. He's not doing it directly though. Other things are doing it.
No,
he's created things that were good in the first place, but then they end up turning evil.
But follow my premise. Follow my premise. This perfect, all-knowing being creates everything. Some of those things are evil. Some of those things are good. Now, the premise when I first got in the call was everyone was saying God can't do evil. So everything that he created, there is no evil in it. Because if you admit that there are things that are evil out there, then God, by in fact creating that, he created evil.
Well,
so you can't escape that. But everything that he's created has to be good because by the first initial statement you guys made,
Thaddeus,
God can only do good.
Thaddeus is making my point here. It's
not really.
God can create things that are good and then allow them to do evil. It would be the case that God would be the cause in some sort of derivative way, and the fact that he created things that do evil, and that's fine.
Like I say, he still causes it indirectly, but not directly.
No, see,
but then you just say that about the good. He doesn't cause the good directly. He caused the good indirectly just by creating the things that were good. I'm saying, how does this argument get us anywhere?
Wait, what?
What do you mean doesn't get us anywhere? We just described what you're...
Because only thing you guys are saying is God is not responsible for evil because he did it indirectly. But then I can make the same argument for the good. People are doing good. God is not direct. God is doing good just because he created them and he's being attributed to the good. So since he is not directly doing the good, then why are you attributing the good to him?
So I don't attribute the good to him in the sense that I only describe the good in the sense that God is what creates the things in the first place. He creates what the things are. He gives them existence, right? Okay. So I hold that everything is good insofar as it exists. I hold to the privation view of evil, right? So I think that evil is the privation of something that something ought to have. So, for example, in a human being, it would be bad for a human being to lack an eye, right? Because that's something that is part of the nature of a human being. It's to have an eye. So I think that God is willing, is creating human nature, for example, and willing that they have eyes, and then sometimes things come in and like mutations or something that corrupts that will.
But could those mutations happen without God?
No, they can't, and I accept that.
Okay, well, my point is, I don't see how this doesn't validate my point, because it seems like, and this is the argument, and I'm just going to explain it the way I understand it, is that we're saying that God, when I first came in a call, God can only do good. Okay, granted, even if I grant you that principle, God can only do good, I said, well then, since God created everything, he created the bad, but now the bad can't be bad because God can only do good. Then the retort to that, which you guys then came back with, is that, well, it's indirect. God indirectly does bad because he's really doing good, and somebody else messes it up and does bad.
Yeah, just think about.
But then my rebuttal. But hold on. Just okay. My rebuttal to that. My rebuttal to that was, well, that's the same way I can do the same thing about bad things, evil things. God does something, it turns out to be bad. He can do the same thing, he turns out to be good. You can't really make a distinction between the two. And now it seems that your argument has developed into one in which God is free of these moral judgments, either good or bad, and that as a consequence of just society, we determine things that are evil. The child with one eye, as an example.
I think
so. Then I would say it seems like you're validating my point, because I am saying I agree with you that you can maybe make no moral judgment against God, but I think by saying that God is good and not accepting that inherently the argument will work for him being evil, then it seems like we're missing the point.
I think you missed something here.
Go ahead, you questions and then we answered them. So I think we did a good job.
Can I respond to that? What he said though. So I just explained to you. So God can only create things existence. He can't create things lack of existence. So that's the sense in which God creates good. He creates things with a specific nature that is directed towards actualizing itself. So human beings are directed by nature towards having eyes, for example. And God creates that. He doesn't create the lack of eyes. The lack of eyes can't be created in the sense of, making something be. God can't give existence to the lack of eyes. That doesn't work. So God creates good in the sense that he creates the existence of things, and that's why I was talking about privation.
Seems pretty legit to me.
Well then, yeah, all you're saying is God is good because God is good. If God created everything, no matter it's good, evil, bad, right or wrong, it's all good because God created it.
That's not what I said.
No, that's not at all. That's like a complete blatant misrepresentation.
Yeah, that isn't what he said. What he's saying is essentially that in the eye example, that if the child comes out with two eyes, that's good because, number one, subjectively, he says it's good because we don't know, he could come out with four eyes, could be better. But now we have the subjective opinion that two eyes is the pinnacle of human experience. So we'll say, all right, two eyes.
Right. And that's
now this two eyes is good. Hold on. Now we're saying two eyes is good. So then he says, okay, well, if this child loses one eye for some reason, then that would be bad, the process of him losing the eye. But when I asked previously, well, is God the reason? Does God create the circumstances in which he loses that eye? Does God create the bacteria, the virus, or whatever causes this child to? Did God create that? Did God make that happen? He then agrees that yes, God makes that happen. So now my confusion goes even farther, because now it seems like the more you try to divorce this God from the moral question, God being good and God being bad, it's impossible for you to do, because even in the examples that you put forth, God is ultimately responsible for the situation.
Sure.
Right. But here's the thing, though. Who's saying that he's not responsible for the situation? I mean, maybe Ouchie might be arguing that, but I'm sure not.
When I'm asking you, does God do evil? Does God do evil and does God do good? You're saying no, God does not do evil. But then all your explanations can either be applied to good also, or really are not explanations at all.
No, listen to me. He does not do evil directly. He does do it indirectly, though.
Yeah,
he's not directly causing it. He's not like raining down evil from his fingertips himself.
Right.
But through his creations, evil can happen.
let me speak to that point directly.
Well, hang on.
When a person does good, when a person does good, and it's not God directly, it's the person that's doing good. You're attributing that good act to God. But when that person does bad, you're saying, well, God didn't directly do that; He indirectly did that.
I don't do any of that.
But that's
right,
exactly
but I don't
what's
do any of that, though.
You're saying if that person does good, attribute it to God. But if that person does bad, then he indirectly didn't.
No, I'm not. When did I say that? I didn't talk about what persons do. I'm talking about God. Okay, well, that's not the argument I'm making then. Maybe Ochi's saying something like that.
You've just said that God indirectly does it. In other words, there's some intervention in between the act and God. So let's say somebody murders someone. Even though God created the murderer, he created the knife, the circumstances, everything that happened in that murder. You're saying he's not responsible for the murder. I'm saying I think he is. If you're going to say he's responsible for good things, which happen in a similar way.
Listen. I understand. Yes, he's responsible. I never argued against that. I'm just saying that he's not directly causing the evil. He indirectly caused it. The fact that I still said he caused it means I'm admitting he's responsible. Now, I don't mean to be angry here, but what part of that eludes you people? I'm not making the exact same argument as Ouchie here.
Well, and I would basically agree with what he's saying, except for that I think that God doesn't directly will that. He's not willing the evil in itself. I think that he's indirectly causing it. So, for example, with your virus example, right? God causes the virus to exist. And insofar as the virus exists, I think that the virus is good. But what's evil is the effect that it causes on the child losing an eye, for example.
But how are you making that judgment? To God, that could be good. It could be good that child lost that virus progressed. God could have some ultimate plan that is good. That was a good thing.
Yeah, of course.
And but he's just judged it as bad.
So I think that, like I said, I think that things have particular natures and they act in a particular way towards particular ends. And I think that they act that way because God created them with those natures and with those ends, right? So whenever it comes to human beings, for example, part of humans' nature is to have two eyes. So I think that in actualizing that, they're fulfilling God's will because that's what God is willing. And I mean, God could will something else. We could be wrong about that, but I think that by seeing what human nature is, we can determine what God's will was.
You threw a lot of assumptions at me. Now you know what God's will is. You know, it may be 2 eyes, it may be 20 eyes. I hate to just make the point, but now you know. You're talking about knowing God's will, and you've deemed this 2 eyes is a part of God's will. I don't know how you can make that statement with any clarity, but I'll even grant the 2 eyes. The God 2 eyes is this relationship. But still, I still don't really understand. And this is not against you, Thaddeus. This is against Ochi. How he's divorcing God from the evil acts, but still attributing God's nature for the good acts. He's saying if you have 2 scenarios, but the outcome is different. One the outcome is good, that is God. One the outcome is evil, that is not God. And I'm trying to understand how he's making that distinction, because right now it seems extremely complicated. It doesn't seem like there's just one thing to say, okay, this is why everything God is, because he's responsible for both good and bad the same. He created them both. He's responsible for situations. He's responsible for every little minute detail that occurs in both. How is the outcome of an evil event different than the outcome of a good event when it comes to this God?
Well, it's just about
right. See, I'd kind of line up towards more what you're saying when it comes along those lines. However, I don't think that provides too much of a problem there. Like some people will say, like it's a contradiction or whatnot, but not really. In fact, I still see it working very well. It doesn't. None of the whole thing, because here's the problem. See, just because we can't understand it doesn't change reality. So I know it's kind of like a hard thing for even myself to accept at times, but that's just kind of the thing.
So,
but anyways,
what I was saying was that it's about God's will. So I think I agree that God is indirectly responsible in the sense that he creates things that will result in evil, right? He creates things that are corruptible. He creates things that have free will and can act against God's will. But ultimately, what we're talking about is what God's will is, right? And I gave the example earlier of if you raised a child, for example, right? You wouldn't, if you did everything right and you were doing everything with the best intentions, you wouldn't blame the parents for the fact that that the children went wrong, because it wasn't directly their fault.
Okay, but hang on, I'd like to say something to that. All right, God is the one that created all man, right? He's the one that gave them every knowledge and capability to do those other things. Parents didn't do that with their children, right? You're saying God is the one who
Right.
created those children with the option to be whatever, right? Because if you look at this place in heaven, there's no sin, no sorrow, no suffering. And the people that go there won't be able to do that. So you can create something without all that evil, sin, sorrow, and suffering.
Right.
But he did this on earth and gave us the option to do that. It means he has to know how it's done, it's got to be part of him to give that option to us. We didn't create it ourselves. It wasn't created outside of God.
Right. See, and again, that's where I would agree with, I guess, the atheistic way of thinking or whatever. But Ozzy's been trying to say something here for a while, I think. Have you not? Because I saw you trying to say something, and then.
Yeah, but I was accidentally intruding on what. Geez, I don't know who was speaking. But anyway, yeah, I did have an objection to Chihuahua's analogy with the parents and children, where you said that we wouldn't hold children morally culpable. But that's true. I mean, if you have a 2-year-old and you go to a party and you get this babe in arms, and the kid lashes out and topples a vase or something like that, we realize that the child is causally responsible for that action. If the child hadn't swung its arm out, the vase would still be intact. But we don't hold the child morally responsible, because we know that that child doesn't possess the necessary motor skills or the understanding of the value of objects, or the sense of private property and things like that, to have made an informed action for which we can hold it accountable. Right? We would nevertheless hold the parents accountable. Right? So there's 3 concepts. There's causal responsibility. If something is the cause of something, it's causally responsible. But for moral accountability, you need more than just causal, or rather, for moral responsibility, you need more than just causal responsibility. So the child is causally responsible, but not morally responsible. The parent is not morally responsible for the child's action, but the parent is culpable. Is not culpable, but accountable. We hold the parent accountable, right? Because we understand that this child is in the care of the parent. So it just seems to me that if God is really, genuinely, the cause of all causes, the ultimate cause, who foresees and anticipates every consequence of his own actions, right? Doesn't matter that they're indirect, right? He knows what the outcome will be. He has perfect knowledge, and he has all the power to prevent it. And yet it only happened within his will. Then if God's not accountable for that, if a being under such circumstances, such ideal circumstances of both moral causation, moral culpability, and moral accountability, if under those circumstances, those concepts don't apply, then they never apply. I mean, it just seems to me that God is in the ultimate position of perfect culpability and accountability, and the perfect position of ultimate praise when he does good. But it just seems to me that what we're hearing is a lot of exculpatory maneuvers here to say that when something good happens, it's okay because God did it. When something
people. Yeah.
I'm just going to finish playing. And when something bad happens, we say, well, that wasn't directly God's will or directly caused by God. It's indirectly caused. But of course, God could have prevented it just as effortlessly, just as easily as a parent might, stop its 2-year-old hand from toppling the vase, right? If a parent wasn't in a position to stop it, then we don't hold the parent culpable, but we'd still hold the parent accountable, right? But God is in a position to prevent any harm or evil, any suffering, even one tear. So that's the difficulty here. So it just sounds like a lot of post hoc rationalizing. Oh, look, there's something that we judge to be an evil. Oh, well, we can't lay that at the doorstep of God. It's merely indirectly caused by God. Or there's something that we think is praiseworthy. Oh, well, that we will lay at the doorstep of God. We get praise for it.
So, yeah, I agree with you, basically. Like, I'm not saying that God could not have, God could have created a world without evil. I agree with that. I also think that God is indirectly responsible. I agree with that as well. And I mean, he's indirectly responsible for the evil we do. He's indirectly responsible for the good we do. He's only directly responsible for creating our existence. So, yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, I've said this earlier in the conversation before everybody joined. I don't think that God is in any way required to not do that. I think that God's goodness is his own essence. I think that God is good. I don't think that anything that God does can affect that, because God's the first cause. And if anything affected his goodness, then he wouldn't really be the first cause, because something would be the cause of his goodness.
Don't we normally apply the predicates good and evil to actions and to moral agents? Is God not a moral agent? Is he an automaton?
I would not say. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if God is an agent and a moral agent, then it seems to me we can legitimately apply the predicates good and evil to him. And if he's not, then we got to stop praising him and calling him good as well. We can't call him evil, and we can't call him good. It just seems to me that we're on the horns of a dilemma here. I don't see how we can affirm his goodness and on the basis of the good things that come from his direct actions and ignore.
Well, hang on. Well, if he's good by definition, then you can call him good. It even says in the Bible he's good.
That's meaningless. I mean, I could say I'm good by definition. Anything I do is good. So, if I pick my nose, that's.
But it's not as simple just saying. Not as simple just saying. It's the fact that he is the deity of this universe, and that is by his nature.
Okay, but no, you got to be careful there. When you say by definition, what you mean to say, and perhaps you're not appreciating what it means to say that something is true by definition. It means it's true by the meaning of the words, right? We're stipulating it, or it's a logical truth, conceptual truth based on the meaning of the concept, right? It's like 1 and 1 is 2. Well, if you understand what 1 is, and you understand what 2 is, and you understand what addition is, and you understand what equality means, you understand that it's true that 1 + 1 = 2. It's a conceptual truth. Or a bachelor is an unmarried man. Okay, that's an analytical truth. Okay, that's true by definition. Okay, is that what we're trying to say? That it's an analytical truth or a logical truth that God is good? I mean, that seems to me that's
because we're not using good the same way.
What's that?
I just want to answer this. So, I'm saying that God is good because of what he is. And so it's not a moral goodness. It's more good in the sense that, say, an ice cream cone is good, right? So God is good because God is our ultimate end. He's the ultimate end of our desires. And so by obtaining to God, by attaining ultimately what's called the beatific vision, the knowledge of God himself, we will become ultimately happy. And in that sense, God is good.
No, but that's to say that God is good for us, right? If one of our ends, right, if the telos of human beings is to know God or be with God or something like that, then it is good for us, to be with God or to know God or be in God or whatever. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about whether God is good, whether or not the predicate is good is legitimately applicable to God. And it would seem, if I understand correctly, that you're using the predicate is good in a completely different sense than when we're applying it to to people and ordinary actions, right? In which case, you
Well,
just
yeah,
need to find out the word because it's equivocating, right?
Well,
right. I think no, I understand that. I feel like there should be another word, but that's kind of how it's used. Colloquially, good does not mean the same thing as what's actually morally good, obviously. So I don't know what other word you would ever use. I mean, that's the word. That's the wording that the theology uses. That's kind of what you're stuck with.
The theological word, good, when it's applied to God, is understood to be moral good, right? As opposed to it tastes good, which is to say that I prefer it. I like it more than something else, right? But God is said to be morally good. He's morally perfect. He's the standard of moral goodness, we're told. So we're not talking about some other kind of good. We're talking about the same kind of good, allegedly.
I disagree. Because
right, but then stop calling it good. Find another term and make it clear, right? Because there's an equivocation going on here.
I don't think there's an equivocation. I think that the good. So I follow Aristotle's definition. The good is what all desire. So what all desire ultimately is God. So all that moral goodness is, and moral goodness is what we ought to do to achieve the good, or a happy life, the good life. That's all that moral goodness is. It's about what we have to do to be good. So it's not really goodness in itself. Morality is not goodness in itself. It's what we ought to do to be good. And for God, all that God has to do to be good is will himself as the end.
But
okay, see, we got another.
He can't do otherwise. He can't will himself not to be, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's ontologically necessary, we're told, right? That's another attribute that has sort of been larded onto God in the course of the millennium of theology, right? With Anselm and others, right? God is said to be necessarily existing, right? He's an ontological and metaphysical necessity. So he can't help but be good, right? So, I mean, it can't be any other way, right? So what you're saying is that there's a property of God that makes him good. But what is this good-making property?
It's being. So it's to be.
Why is being God good? Give me the reason for that.
Sorry, it's existence itself. It's being. Being in itself is good. Is the position that I hold.
I submit that it depends what you are. Satan's
hang on, I want
good, presumably.
Right, but
I want to address this comment in the live chat. George says, so God of the Bible can't be good because he's written as a globe killer and tells people to kill his enemies. That's just the type of reactionary things I'd expect to happen. Again, we've already established how, again, this has nothing to do with what we find disgusting or uncomfortable. It's about what actually is moral or not. And in that situation, perhaps those people shouldn't have been alive because they would have caused more suffering on the earth. Yeah, it is messed up, but I'm only human. So are you.
God could have just wanted them dead.
Yeah, he
God
could have
just wanted them dead, and that was good because it's from God.
He could have, but the chances are that's probably not what happened.
Okay, so
I'm still not hearing the argument. I'm not hearing the argument for this position. I'm hearing claims about the meaning of good that are unargued for.
Right. So let me argue for it then. Okay. So like I was talking about the privation view of evil, right? So the position for Satan, for example, would be that he's evil because he's ultimately acting against his. Well, he's evil in two different ways. It's evil for us. It's not good for us, and it's a bad thing for him as well. So for us, it's bad because he's trying to deceive us and direct us away from the ultimate good, which is God, right? And for himself, he's acting against his own nature. He's acting against what it is to be him. So to be, he was ultimately created as an angel of light that was supposed to glorify God, and now he's acting against that. So to tie this back to why this ties into being, right? So in a way, since he's not actualizing what it is to be Satan as God created him, as what it is to be Satan, he's sort of a lesser degree of being, if you can see what I'm trying to say here. And
there's this idea of a chain of being, that
right.
God expresses the greatest degree of being, and everything as it moves away from God, admits of lesser and lesser reality, less and less being. It's a theory called representative reality.
Right. Right. So ultimately, whenever things are acting in a particular way, they're actualizing their nature and becoming closer to God. And that's the idea. And since God is being itself, it's actually ultimately just because God's the end of everything. He's the ultimate end of everything. That's what makes him good.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't understand why God being the end of everything makes it good. I mean, ends what we're told are exactly the kinds of things that don't justify the means, right? And ends are the very things that we're told, yeah, according to deontologists. And maybe you're not a deontologist, actually. But according to deontology,
No, it's more the fact that human ends don't necessarily justify the means. See, there's a difference between what you know is a limited knowledge and then what humans can do. I mean, and then what God can do, sorry.
Well, the argument is more general than that. It's that ends can't justify means, that the means have to be right and justifiable in and of themselves, and not by appeal to some end. It doesn't matter if it's a human end. It doesn't matter if it's an angel or a human doing it. And I'm still puzzled by this idea that we want to apply a moral predicate to a being that can't do anything other than what it does, right? I mean, God can't do anything less than some ideal of moral perfection. But we don't have an idea of what a moral perfection is apart from whatever it is that God does. And so it just seems to me that this conception of goodness being explained in terms of God's ultimate nature as being is merely to say that God is good because God is God. Right, but that seems to beg the question: why is God good? What is good about God? And to say that, well, it's because he's God, that's not an answer.
It's because he's desirable.
He's more
desirable.
No, but what if
it's also more around the fact
that's to say that he's desirable. To be desirable is to be desired by some beings. Does God desire himself? Because there was a time, presumably, when we weren't here. Right?
Actually, he does.
But that's just stipulation. These are not facts and evidence, right? This is just a declaration.
Well, right,
I could say the same about Satan and declare Satan to be the ultimate standard.
The best you can do is just assume things. That's the problem. The thing is, it's like you got like this. You got something like, for instance, like an ant or a fly or whatever, right? Now, an ant or a fly cannot at all comprehend what exactly human is all about, how they think and how they act or whatnot, because an ant or a fly does not have that same mental intellect. It's the same way with us humans trying to figure out like what God is like. It's like God is so far beyond any of our understanding that a lot of these really are kind of just speculations, and you do kind of have to go with what some weird hooby-dooby philosopher type people say, because that's the best you got. I mean, it might not be true, but I mean, that's kind of the only way you can really reconcile it, other than basically going full, well, wait, what did you say? Like, I like to do a lot? Because I feel like that's the more practical reason, instead of trying to justify it all by deep philosophy. Because other than that, you really cannot understand, like, what God is kind of up to, why things are the way they are. The best you can do is just say, hey, I like what's going on and I'll worship him, or no, I think this is all BS and I'm not gonna. And that's kind of it.
Yeah,
well, you said something there. Oh, so go ahead, Archie.
I was just going to say I completely disagree with Thaddeus. So
me too.
Anything that he says, because I think there is a way we can know. So if we can say that God has will, right? If we can say that God has will, I think we have to presuppose that for the sake of this argument, right? So if God has will, he necessarily has to will himself as the end. He has to will himself. The reason is because the end is, or whatever you're willing, is ultimately a cause of you willing, right? So if I will that I eat steak tomorrow, that steak in some sense is the cause of me willing the steak, right? So since nothing can be the cause of God's will, since he's the first cause other than himself, he has to will himself as the end. And in creating everything else that exists, he also has to will as the end himself for all those other things that are existing as well.
So if God didn't will himself to exist, what would happen?
Well, he necessarily does have to do that.
No. Wait. It seems to me you're trying to have it both ways. You're saying he wills himself to exist, but it seems to me he can't not exist. So this is an instance of God's inefficacious will. He's willing himself to exist, but he doesn't need to bother, because he could try to will otherwise if he wanted, nothing would happen because he necessarily exists. Right? In other words, his willing to exist, his willing himself to exist, is something he can't accomplish. It's already done. He's a necessary being. Right? So his willing himself to exist achieves nothing, and he couldn't do otherwise anyway. It just so happens, as a kind of fifth wheel in your explanatory machine here, God wills himself to exist, but it's causally and explanatorily inefficacious. It accomplishes nothing. And if it wasn't there, the facts would remain the same about God's existence. So I don't see how, I think the reason you're positing that God has to will himself to exist is because you posited that there's this ultimate end of existence, and that it depends on a kind of universal wanting this existence to be, and you recognize, well, it can't rest on us because God existed before we did. So God's being good can't be because he's our end and we want him to exist. So he has to want himself to exist. But if he's a necessary being, then his wanting himself and willing himself to exist doesn't do anything.
Okay,
it's efficacious.
So suppose, for the sake of the argument, so suppose that you one day achieve all of your ends, you achieve everything that you desire. Does it follow that you no longer will that you have those ends? I don't think so. I think that it's just the case that you have achieved
wants. At that point, these are the things that I wanted to be true that are done. There's all kinds of things that I wanted to be true that I have accomplished, that I'm glad are true, but I don't have to keep willing them to be true. They're true. It's done. I wanted to reach the age of 20. Done and dusted. I was once 20. I've accomplished the goal of living to 20. Okay. In fact, I've superseded that goal. Right. I am very glad that I lived to 20. I wouldn't have wanted it any other way. Hoping to reach 60 someday, and 80. But I am no longer willing myself to be 20. So once something is accomplished, it is accomplished.
I think we must mean will in a different way.
Again, this is exactly right. We are meaning will in a different way here. Just like we're meaning good in a different way. When it comes to God, everything that we're trying to predicate about God, things like will, things like mind, things like action, things like morality, these are predicates that when we apply them to ourselves, we know exactly what we mean. But when we apply them to God, language is going on holiday. The wheels have come off. We don't know how to apply these predicates to this kind of being. Right? It's not that we don't know enough about this being. It's that the terms seem to fall apart. The meaning of these terms gets evacuated when we're talking about a being that wants nothing, needs nothing, should desire nothing. Why does a being like that have a mind? God needs a mind like a plant needs a mind.
Okay, so you said a lot of things there. I don't think what I think is that what we mean by will is different. I'm not talking about just for God. I think that the way that you're using the term will and the way that I'm using the term will is different. Like, I don't think, because you seem to think that it means that you have to, in some way, create something or some way.
Yeah, you have to be intending something. It has to be your intention. You don't have to be actually accomplished. I can will something to happen before it happens, right? And the willing, like I can will my arm to go up, and so I can decide to raise my arm, right? So there's the will that precedes my arm going up, and then there's the will in action, sometimes called the intention in action, when my arm goes up, right? So I'm not suggesting that the will always has to be realized, but the point is, you don't need to will something once it's accomplished. And God's existence is a fait accompli. It's an accomplished fact. He's metaphysically and ontologically necessary. He can't will himself not to exist. So his will isn't, whatever's responsible for his existence, it can't be his will.
Right. Well, I don't think it's responsible for existence. I think, well, never mind. So what I mean by will is simply a directedness towards a particular end. So by an act of reason, basically. So I think that the fact that I will steak today means that I would like a steak today, and or if so say I will that I have a steak tomorrow at 12:30 p.m. I think that I can still will that now. I think I can will that tomorrow. I think I can will that while I'm eating the steak. I think I can still will that I had the steak, and I think that I can still will that I had the steak after I had the steak.
I don't think you can will that steak, the one you've eaten. I don't think you can will that steak. You can will yourself to want to have another steak tomorrow. But remember, this is a clear thing that God is willing for. God wills it to be the case that he will exist.
Hey, I think I fixed the audio.
Yet it's impossible for him. What's that?
I think fix the audio because what was happening before is I was using my phone. I wanted to run it with my computer, and now I figured out what the problem was. Apparently, I had my audio turned down in the control panel. So, again, now I don't need to use my phone at the same time and have myself in here as the on the computer.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it doesn't make a lot of sense to compare, me willing a steak or me willing that I live to 20 or something like that. I mean, the reason I once willed that I would live to 20 when I was, say, younger than 20, was that because I understood that it was quite possible that I might not live to 20. It's possible that I would die before the age of 20. Right? Now I will that I will live to 60. Right? Why? Because it's conceivable that I will not live to 60. Anything can happen between now and then. But God can't help but exist. What's he bothering willing his existence for? So by hypothesis, he exists necessarily. There's no point in his willing this. It accomplishes nothing.
I agree.
It's a pointless exercise of a will, and because it is literally, on your view, a logical impossibility that he not exist. Now, in my view, it's possible that a God could not exist. I think if God exists, he's a contingent being like everything else that we're aware of, right? But if he's a necessary being, then okay, then well, there's a lot of things that follow, and among other things, he's not going to have a will that he exists. He can will all kinds of things to happen in the world, but what he can't do is will that he himself will exist. Okay. For the reasons that I've given.
But I think of will more along the lines of like desire. That's kind of like similar kind of thing that I'm thinking of. It's so like the technical jargon would be a rational appetite. So I think more of the will as something that you apprehend. You apprehend something as good, and you desire that thing. That's ultimately the way that I think of it. Think of the will. So. You can think so I would think that I can desire I can like the fact or will the fact or love the fact that I in the past ate steak. I wouldn't have it any other way. As you were saying, with you're perfectly happy that you reached the age of 20. So I think that we must be using the term will differently. Well, I mean, it's the way that I use will. I don't know. I get it from scholastic philosophy. That's
well, by will.
Okay, we're using the philosophy definition.
Well, we're discussing philosophy and theology here. I mean,
true.
I don't know. I don't understand this animosity people have with using philosophical terminology in a philosophical domain. I mean, we're talking about
because sometimes we're meaning the theological definition of some things. Otherwise, we're just going to be at language disconnect.
There's no distinction here between the theological will and the philosophical will. I mean, even the scholastic philosophers distinguished between wanting and willing. You could want something and not will it, right? There's all kinds of. I mean, precisely what it means to exercise your willpower is to will to do something you don't want to do, right? Or to refrain willingly, exercising your will to do something that you do want to do, and so forth, right? I mean, will and want, even to the scholastics, even the medieval philosophers, has always been distinct, right? Will and want are not the same. And so to conflate the two. So I can agree that God might approve that he exists, right? I can approve that there's a glass of water over here. My approving that there's a glass of water is, you know, irrelevant to there being a glass of water. And similarly, God's approving that he himself exists and has being is not responsible, isn't accomplishing anything with respect to the fact that he exists, right? But will is the kind of thing which does bring about effects. Merely wanting something doesn't happen. Typically, will and want go together because you normally will the things that you want. Not always. Sometimes you will things against what you want. Which is exactly what we mean by cases of exercising willpower. You want one thing, but you will another thing. You will yourself not to smoke when you're dying, craving, aching to have a cigarette, for instance. But you just will yourself not to light up. Okay. So will and want don't mean the same thing, even in medieval and scholastic philosophy. In fact, I think we should have looked at them for actually sharpening up that difference between willing and wanting.
I think that you've misinterpreted, or maybe the scholastic, maybe the Thomistic definition is different than some scholastic definitions because they're not necessarily the same. But I know that St. Thomas Aquinas claims that if any good that you apprehend, and you apprehend as good rationally, you necessarily will that. And all that the good is something that is desired or something that's desirable. So I don't really see a difference between.
Yeah, St. Thomas Aquinas, I think, was just flatly wrong on that. The fact that you apprehend some good does not mean that you would will it. I mean, just psychologically, that's false on its face. People often apprehend that something is good and that they ought to do it, or that something is preferable and better, and still don't bring it about. Very often because they have some, maybe a selfish concern or interest or motivation that they fall prey to, even though they recognize that there's something there that they should will but fail to will. In other words, we can see things and want things and fail to will them, and we can will things that we don't want. And if I'm trying to remember, does Thomas say that? What you said? I mean, I can't think of an instance where he said that, but I mean, his works are vast, so I'll take you at your word. But
when it comes to God, for example, so when it comes to God, for example, he claims that if people saw God in his essence, people could not help but to will God, but to desire God, I guess.
That's like saying if that girl knew me really, really well, she'd love me. That this again is stupid.
Yeah, see, and this is something as a misotheist I'd have to agree with you on. Maybe I don't want what God wants or whatnot. Maybe he thinks I do, but that might not be the case.
Let's grant it, right? Let's assume that it's true that if everyone understood God in his ultimate glory, we would all want him and all desire him. Okay, that doesn't escape.
It's a stretch.
Okay, well, I know, but let's grant it for arguendo. For the sake of argument, let's grant that. It doesn't shore up the point that the bone of contention between us here about God willing his own existence. So I mean, on your view, to say that God wills his existence is not that he exercises his will, that he's trying to accomplish something. No, what you mean is by God willing himself to exist is that he approves of his own existence. But approving of something's existence doesn't bring it about, right? Merely approving of something doesn't, right? Normally we understand that you have to do something. There's some kind of mental act, an intention, right? And then that intention has to be realized somehow. But apparently none of this machinery is going to be applicable here for God because he already exists necessarily, right? And if it were the case that these facts were the things that made his existence necessary, that would be fine. But the idea of a will is that you could withhold your will. You could not will something. But if God exists necessarily, and he exists, and if you were to try to say that he exists necessarily because he wills himself to exist, then it would have to be at least logically possible to say that he could desire not to will himself, or just not will himself, or not approve of himself, right? But I presume you would not want to say that it's possible that God would not want himself to exist, not approve of his existence, or not will himself to exist, whichever term you would want to use.
I think you're conflating will with free will, don't you think?
Willing with free will?
Yeah.
I don't really worry about free will. I'm only concerned with the will. I don't know what free will means.
Because you're saying that God would have to not be able to will that, and not being able to not will a particular.
It would have to be possible. It would have to be conceivable that he could not will himself, right? Like it might be, I might be physically determined to do whatever it is that I decide and will to do, right? But it's at least conceivable that I could have willed otherwise, even if it's physically impossible that I could have done otherwise. It might be physically impossible for me to not raise my arm in this example that I'm giving, where I just raised my arm, okay? But it's at least conceivable that I could have not raised my arm. It's just not, perhaps it's not physically possible for me not to will my arm when I will my arm to go up, if physical determinism is true. But it's still logically possible. It's not incoherent. It's not a contradiction, right? But I think you don't want to suggest that it works that way for God, right? That it's somehow logically coherent and consistent to imagine that God Almighty could in principle, but wouldn't actually, but could in principle, not will himself to exist or not approve of his own existence.
Right. Yeah, I don't think that God could will other than, I think he necessarily wills himself.
Right. So God necessarily exists, and he necessarily wills himself. Right? What is the question getting out of God, saying God wills himself to exist?
Would it help?
Like,
so
what is it accomplishing?
So under the Trinitarian view, right? So he's willing himself in the sense that he's willing the Word, which is simply God is conceived, or Jesus Christ, and that's the sense in which he's willing himself. So it's more along the lines of loving himself is more along the lines of what I would put it.
Okay, so God loves himself, but okay, so God loves himself, but
what sustains God in his existence, Achuala?
Right.
So what sustains God in his existence is his essence, because his essence is existence.
No, but wait a minute. Now you're just saying God exists because he exists. I mean, the reason he exists is because his essence is an existing essence, right?
Yeah, this is a fun one.
That is a completely vacuous tautology. I don't think I want to go there.
You might have to, though. What else are you going to try and justify his existence by, though?
Well,
that'd be my answer, too, probably.
Yeah. I think, it seems to me possible. I mean, I can't think of one off the top of my head here. But I mean, if you could infect an argument where you could establish the impossibility of the contrary of God's existence. If you could establish that it was impossible that God not exist, as opposed to simply declaring or stipulating that God has to exist and therefore can't exist. If you actually had an argument that showed that God's non-existence entailed a contradiction, right? Mm-hmm. Then by reductio ad absurdum, you would have shown that God exists as a matter of logical necessity. And that if he exists out of logical necessity, I don't think you need to worry about physical necessity or metaphysical necessity. Right. That would be convincing.
The only way you can do that is by saying that God's identity is to exist, because that's the only way that
issue. That's an issue, right? I mean, we were talking about God's existence and whether he exists and what his nature is, and then it seems to me that your premise and your conclusion are identical here, right?
Whether God exists and whether
that can happen.
So whether God exists and whether God's essence is existence, I think they're two different questions.
Wait, why is the...
I didn't catch the distinction. Sorry, Thaddeus. I just want to hear how you all say that again. I didn't quite catch
whether God exists and whether it is the case that God's essence is existence. I think they're two different questions. If it is the case that so here the issue is that we don't know what it is to exist in itself. We've never experienced something that just is existence, right? So I don't think we can determine, like, from the ontological argument for God's existence, I don't think we can just define God as existing and say, oh, well, therefore God exists. That's not the kind of thing I'm saying.
What exactly?
The ontological argument doesn't. I mean, I think.
Is it even possible to experience non-existence?
No. Then
Well,
you don't exist.
I'm experiencing the non-existence of the Roman gods right now.
Oh.
Yeah, it's just like
there's an infinity of things that don't exist, none of which I'm experiencing. I'm experiencing their non-existence right now.
That's a fun one too, but I'm not going to go there.
Once I'm God, I won't be able to experience that. But there's all the failure of things to exist is very easy to experience. We're experiencing all those non-existent things right now. That is, we're experiencing their non-existence.
Wait, but I wanted to know why his premise and conclusion being the same doesn't work in that scenario. I know typically in philosophy or whatever that doesn't work, but we're not talking about our typical scenario, though. This is God. So that actually describes it pretty nicely, what he said. God existing because he exists. If he's like the beginning of all the rest of the things, they all stem down from there. That's your little axiom right there.
That's not... Just to be clear, that's not exactly what I said. I said that God exists necessarily, like he can't cease to exist because he is what it is to exist. I didn't say that he exists because he exists. That's different.
It is?
Well, yeah, I have to say that did sound a little bit hair-splitty there, but no, but let's flesh it out. No, because it's very easy in these things to sort of miss distinctions that are real, right? Because of the wording sounds similar. Can you flesh that out a bit?
Okay, so here's the thing. Okay, so yeah, it is the case that if there is a being that has the essence of existence, then it necessarily does exist, right? And we can determine just from knowing that the essence of God's existence, the essence of God is existence, that God exists. I agree with that. But the issue is that we don't know that there's a being that has the essence, of which his essence is existence. We don't know that.
Hang on, I wanted to address something in the live chat. Mr. Yeah, there he is. He says, when will theists figure out that they are working too hard to imagine their God concept is good, objectively moral, when it's so easily disputed? And when they have to work so hard to hedge and change the meaning of terms to keep it true for them? Well, just again, because you can't quite grasp it, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true. I mean, Ouchi's kind of doing his best he can to describe it in philosophical terms. But again, this is the best you got, as I said back when I was on the phone. A lot of this, I will agree, is kind of pure speculation. And the best you can really do is be able to say, well, hey, I mean, I don't understand everything, but, all we can really do, I guess, is go by what the theology says. And then anything else philosophically really is kind of just like speculation.
I think it's worse than speculation. I mean, first of all, if this kind of speculation is the best that we can do, then it's not good enough. I mean, then I think we should just jettison the entire enterprise if this really is the best that we can do. But I think the reason is not because it's speculative. We speculate all the time. All science begins with speculation. It all starts with speculation and working out the implications of a hypothesis or theory that seems very far-flung and is completely underdetermined by the evidence. The evidence has not risen yet to meet the theory and corroborate it. I mean,
Right, but-
everything that's ever been established as a robust scientific fact.
Okay, because when you say
no, but hang on, but see, the problem here is not that it's speculative, but that it's stipulative, right? We're told, God is this way. He has these properties, has these omni attributes, and so forth. And those properties, it's massively unclear what they mean when we apply them to this kind of being. When you say, Joni loves Chachi, I know what that means. But when you say God is love, it's unclear what that means, right? It's unclear what it means for a being to be loved. It's perfectly clear to us all what it means for a person to be in love. We've experienced it ourselves. We see it all around us. We have some sense of how that word is being used. And when we say that a person is powerful and that person is more powerful than that person, we can mean that they're more powerful in terms of their mental capacity, they're more powerful in terms of their physical prowess, they're more powerful in terms of agility or some other respect. And when we say a person is very knowledgeable, you can measure degrees of knowing, how who knows more than another person and so forth. But as soon as you start saying that a being is omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing, omnibenevolent, all-loving, then all of a sudden it's as if we've taken these ordinary words, which in their mundane usage make perfect sense, and then we've just sort of amplified it, and then we don't know what we mean. We don't know what omnipotence means. That's why there's so many different definitions, competing definitions of the word omnipotent. And it would be easy to settle if we could have an omnipotent being that we could look and go, oh, there's an omnipotent being now. So this is the right definition of omnipotence.
Isn't omnipotent just that that the being can do anything?
Well,
or is that
no,
omnipotent?
actually, there's a huge controversy. I mean, I got a video on my channel about this, about omnipotence, and the whole, can God lift a rock too heavy for me to lift? I mean, there are people who believe that God is all-powerful, and what that means is that God can do everything that is logically possible, right? But then there are people who say, oh, no. God created logic too, so he stands outside of logic, right? Yeah. He's not bound and limited by logic. You and I are bound and limited by logic, and it makes it impossible
he's
to
not.
imagine what God can do. But God can do contradictions, right? You can't understand them, but, sucks to be you mortal thing that is bound by logic. God is not so limited, right?
Yeah,
so
what exactly is wrong?
God do the impossible? According to some theories of omnipotence, that's precisely what omnipotence would mean. That he could do that, right? God could cease to exist and exist again, right?
Okay.
And God could be both moral and immoral. He could do contradictions, and it wouldn't be a problem. It'd be a problem for us, and it's a problem for us to understand it, right? So words like omnipotent and omnibenevolent and omniscient and all-loving, right? These are just, it's like turning up the dial on what a concept means, but exporting it out of the world where it's ordinarily applied and is meaningful, and then slapping them all together. So not only do we not know that this being exists, we don't know that he or she has these attributes, and then once we've slapped on these attributes, it's not even clear what any of these attributes mean. So, and as a result, we don't understand the being that we're talking about, right? And there are some people out there that are called atheists who think that the concept of God is so muddled, and there's no two people that have the same concept of God because the predicates are so ill-defined.
So what's the problem with it being logically non-contradictory? I mean, I think that's a pretty good picture right there. If God is so far beyond us, he should feel like he contradicts things to us.
Well, first of all, we don't know that God is so far beyond us. I mean, for all we know, God is a little machine that grinds out particles, and that causes the expansion of space-time or something like that. I mean, we don't know that it's a being with a will, like, right? Whatever.
Well, if we're going to go by the Christian view, which I'm not a Christian, but I do subscribe to that particular version of God, we do know that he is far beyond us and everything. So if we're going to, because we got to start somewhere.
Since we're stipulating that, we are told that God is great and glorious and magnificent and has all these.
Says so in the Bible too.
And that's when I say we're told this. That's what I'm saying is we have ancient writings that tell us that God is this way, and then that we have philosophers have then tried to unpack some of that. Theologians, I should say.
Ozzy, don't you think there's a difference between saying a difference between whether God exists and whether or not we can, have a perfect understanding of God?
Of course, absolutely. Oh yeah. Listen, we don't need we don't understand dark matter and dark energy, right? I mean, much of that is just positing stuff, right? We posited black holes before we discovered that any existed, right? There were mathematical reasons and reasons within physics models that predicted the existence of these weird things, right? We didn't know that they existed, and we had to discover them. Okay. The Higgs boson, gravity waves. These are all things that, the planet Neptune had to be posited. We didn't know it existed, right? And some of these things are truly weird, right? Like things like gravity waves. I mean, it's not like we encounter gravity waves or anything like them ordinarily in the world. Or black holes are, really, really bizarre things, right? So it's not even that we had phenomena like them, right? So it's okay to posit something that's fantastical, okay? But I wouldn't want to organize my life around the theory of black holes before there's any evidence of them. It's okay to speculate. Maybe there's a being that's like this, but it just seems to me that nothing about God is discovered. All of it is stipulated.
Well, here's the thing. I don't organize my life around it either. I mean, maybe that's what Ouchie does, but it is some sort of being that you can't really get a full grasp on. So it would be kind of, weird to, have your whole life basically be based on this being. That's not what I do. However, I can still admit that from some of the other things that I've seen, that, that I am convinced that this God exists. But yeah, to organize your life around this and just have to trust that go God's ways or not our ways and stuff, no, that is, for me, taking it a step way too far. Because now you are going into the whole fact of, now it's no longer just me speculating on this being, and now it's me actually having to, basically center my life around a being that I barely even understand, that I really would just be going off of what other people say, that, this being knows what's good for me and everything. So yeah, I do agree with you there, Ozzy, that it would be, a little, I guess, in some ways unwise, at least in my opinion, to follow this being. I mean, maybe that is a good objection when
I wouldn't
Christians, but I'm not a Christian, so.
Yeah, my argument or my objection. First of all, my objection is a little stronger than that. I mean, you don't have to go so far as organizing your life around a hypothetical entity for it to be irrational to believe in it, right? I mean, it was okay for physicists to posit the planet Neptune, and to be guardedly optimistic that they would discover such a planet. Okay, and how did they, figure out where Neptune? Well, let's say Pluto. It was true for Neptune, but let's do Pluto, right? I mean, how did they figure out where Pluto was? Well, they figured out where Pluto was. They ultimately discovered it using comparing photographic plates, but they knew where to look and where to take photographs of the night sky, because there were perturbations in Neptune's orbit, and they said, well, the best way to explain these weird eccentricities in the orbit of Neptune is if there was this thing out there about this far away, about this mass, and at this position, and at this orbital distance. If there was a mass out there, right, following this trajectory, that would explain the trajectory of Neptune. Right? So we posited Pluto before we ever found it, and then in the 1930s, Clyde Tombaugh found it on some photographic plates. And the same kind of story can be told about the Higgs boson and gravity waves and black holes. These are all theoretical posits, okay? But I submit that there's a difference between that kind of speculation and the speculation that we find in theology. And that is that the speculations of the scientific sort that I described were speculations born of looking at the evidence. There were models, effectively, that predicted that we should find such and so, and there were specific predictive expectations generated by the model. And then we went and looked, and if we found it, great. And if we didn't find it, we would withhold our assent. We wouldn't say, well, we're convinced that it's true, even though the evidence is there, right? Like, I mean, researchers routinely, doggedly pursue a hypothesis before they've established that it's true, right? But they won't go so far as to say, we know that it's true, it's established fact, right? And the difficulty that I have with a lot of these theological concepts is not that they are theologically or philosophically exploring a concept and working it out, and it's highly speculative and it's confusing and we don't have a good understanding of it. That's not the objection. The objection that I have is that people are insisting that it's true, that it has the force of a dogma. Right? You're required to believe that this kind of being exists and he has these kinds of problems. That's the problem I have. I mean, if science proceeded this way dogmatically, science wouldn't proceed anywhere, actually.
So, but Ozzy, I mean, you know that it's not just like theists are just positing that God exists.
No, they're positing on the basis of texts that describe it, that tell stories about a God, right?
Typically,
so are texts automatically not true now?
No, it's just that the texts are the claim. They're not the evidence. They're not data.
But you can go back historically too. I mean, I know General's not here, but he'd probably like to show you some things about what happened in the Near East that you can probably look at that are like.
There's no fact about God you can show in archaeology. There's all kinds of facts about things that happened in history that are described in the Bible, but there's no fact about God's nature and his attributes that can be demonstrated by looking at a fact of history. Because every fact of history is consistent with God existing or God not existing, or some other God.
So existing. You don't really take anything seriously, like, you know, Shroud of Turin or anything.
Well, that I think has been debunked as a forgery. But there's plenty of things that we know from history and archaeology and linguistics and Egyptology that absolutely corroborate many things that are told in the Bible. Right?
But I think there's also some new things.
For instance, but I know that there was a King David, right? I know that there was a first temple in Jerusalem.
Yeah. Well, shouldn't that tell you something? I'm not just going to throw it all out.
I don't throw it out. You didn't hear me throw it out. I said that there's no fact described in the Bible that we can corroborate through history or archaeology or any other means that implies that this God exists, right? The fact that there was a first temple, right, built to Yahweh doesn't imply that Yahweh exists. Because if that were true, all the temples to all the other gods that have ever been built would be evidence for those gods, right? So I don't deny that the Bible is a mixture of fable and fantasy and poetry and historical chronicle. There's historical chronicle in there, plenty of it, but none of it implies the extravagant metaphysics about God. None of those facts that we've discovered that we can corroborate imply the existence of God. But Ouchie, you were trying to get in there for a second there.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, you know, I know Thaddeus doesn't want us to go down this route, and I'm actually having an argument on the existence of God, like a debate, I think, on Sunday with somebody. I think it's going to be, I think Steve's moderating. I don't know. They're setting it up, so it might be on one of these channels. But they have philosophical arguments that they, you know, it's not usually just the Bible says so, therefore it's true. Usually, whenever theologians argue, they put philosophical arguments. You may not agree with it, but it's not like they're just saying, well, here's a claim, therefore it's true.
No, that's true. No, I'm not saying that there's no arguments. I'm saying that the arguments are based on stipulative definitions about the attributes of God. Okay? It's not that there aren't rational, I mean, in other words, there's all kinds of things which, if you accept the stipulative definitions, if you accept that this property makes sense, okay, and if you accept that these properties go together and that they all inhere in this one being, and we call this being God, then you can try to marshal arguments for why that God exists. I mean, take St. Thomas's 5 ways. In Summa Theologica, Thomas Aquinas offers 5 proofs of God. He thinks there are 5 proofs. I mean, it's obviously contentious, right? But each one of those proofs is supposed to imply something about the nature of God. So one of the proofs implies that God is a necessary being. Another is that he's morally good. Another is, and so she's got all these proofs of God, and if those proofs of God are true, if those, I mean, they're supposed to be true, so the premises are true and the inference rules are valid, so the argument is valid and sound, then it would imply that that being possesses a certain quality or certain property, right? I'm not denying that you can do that, right? What I was arguing about here was that the features like the omni-attributes, like that he's a necessary being and stuff like that, we don't know what these predicates even mean. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to say they all inhere in one being. You know, I mean, that's just not something that we can establish. And some of the predicates are so unclear. I mean, what is the correct definition of omnipotence, right? Here's another one. Omniscience. Here's a predicate. Omniscience. Right? God is all-knowing. Does God know the future? Does he know every future fact? Does he know everything that could have been but wasn't? Right? Well, some people will say yes. Others will say no. God doesn't know. God can predict the future just like you and I can predict the future without knowing the future. Right? He doesn't see the future. And others say no, that's exactly what God can do. He can see the future. Right?
I don't think disagreements about what the definitions means that they're incoherent, though. Right?
No,
You just look it up what it means.
No, it's that these are competing definitions, and we don't know that there's anything that answers to any of these definitions. Right? You can define omniscience and omnipotence, each of those terms, 50 different ways. But then the question is there anything in reality, even metaphysical reality, outside of our ordinary physical world, is there anything in this physical world or outside the physical world, if there be such a thing, that answers to any of these definitions? And we're not in a position to know which of these definitions is applicable to anything, if any of them are, right? Much less specifying that this definition of omniscience and this definition of omnipotence and this definition of omnipresent and this definition of being all-loving and that all of these things inhere in one being. That seems to me to be all pure stipulation about what the words mean. And then you get this massive speculation on top of that they all inhere together in one being. Right? It seems to me that a handier, if I were a Christian, and I was once, but and I didn't think this at the time, but if I were a Christian today, what I would say is this: there's a lot of figurative language in the Bible, and when they say God is all powerful, they just mean He's the most powerful thing, and it's hyperbolic language. Right? And when they say God is all-knowing, they just mean He knows more than anything else. And what's the limit of all-knowing? Well, who knows? We're not even going to try to define what it means to be all-knowing. He knows more than anybody else. What is the extent? What falls into the extension of being all-knowing? It's unclear, right? We're not able to establish that, right? And it seems to me that would still be a God worthy of worship. If there existed a being that was responsible for all of physical reality as we know it, and that being was powerful in the sense of being able to bring things into existence by uttering a command, let there be light, or something like that. And if he knew more than all of us, and he could predict the future and make prophecies come true and all that, that would be a being worthy of worship. I'd bow down and kneel to that thing, unless it was an evil God, right? So it just seems to me that I don't understand the impetus, the motivation that theologians have to lard their God with all of these highfalutin, I think really vainglorious epithets that we don't know are right. We don't know that these definitions apply.
Well, there's two different ways of looking at it. A, they're doing it because, first of all, in order to even have these conversations, you kind of have to start having terms that are at least close. You got to at least try to get close to what this God or whatever means or represents or whatnot, even if you don't quite know what the definition is, or if God particularly follows what it means to be omnipotent or whatever. You got to at least try to get close to even have these deep theological conversations in the first place. And B, a lot of times apologetics isn't really about, even though people use it in this way, a lot of times it's not really about trying to get atheists or whatever to turn into Christians. It's mostly about Christians that are having problems with their faith in the first place, or they're having a little bit of doubts and trying to keep them in the faith. It's a lot more effective against people that already believe and stuff. And even though I'm not a Christian, someone like me who at least believes this God exists, it's way more effective on people like me in that than it will be ever against, like atheists and agnostics, people who, don't already hold to this God, but just have a little bit of doubt or whatnot, right? That's mainly what these apologetics that are for. It's to keep people within the fold, not necessarily to get people who have left the fold back in.
I think that's partly true. I think a lot of apologetics is about creating a veneer of intellectual respectability for what are believed simply on the basis of the dogmas that you're supposed to believe. But I don't think apologetics is just that. I think there is that, right? There are people shilling for God, shilling for their religion specifically, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think that's all apologetics is, right? Apologetics is also, look, I have these beliefs. There are these dogmas, and when I say dogmas, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I just mean the things that your religion requires that you believe. Okay, like there are political dogmas. If you belong to the Republican Party, you're supposed to affirm that anthropogenic climate change does not happen, is not a thing, right? There are things that you're supposed to believe by virtue of identifying with a certain group. Okay? That's what I mean by a dogma. As opposed to saying that a person is dogmatic, which I think really does mean the person is closed-minded. That's another thing. Okay? But when I say dogma, I just mean these are the things that you are committed to believing. You pledged allegiance to believing these things as a part of identifying with a certain group. Now, so a lot of apologetics is about sort of painting this veneer of intellectual respectability over all of this, where it sometimes doesn't make sense. But it's not just that. I mean, if you are a rational epistemic agent and you happen to believe this religion and you want to be responsible, you're going to try to make sense of what you believe. You're going to try to say, well, I need to come up with an articulate vision of the world. I have to make sense of what appears to be, maybe hazy concepts or kind of holes in the worldview, or perhaps inconsistencies, right? I mean, everybody should, at some point in their life, reflect on their belief set, whether it's a religious one or not, and sift through and look for inconsistencies, and look for beliefs that are not borne by evidence, and see if you can come up with a way of shoring them up and making sense without doing violence to something else that you believe and are committed to, right? So I think that there's a perfectly noble and rational motivation for doing apologetics, right? Whatever it is you believe, you have a responsibility to try to make sense of it, right? You shouldn't, what I think is wrong though, is nobody should ever be loyal to their beliefs. People, it sounds weird because people think, oh, you've got to be loyal to your principles. And well, I mean, if they're your principles, you should live by them. But you shouldn't be loyal to your beliefs, right? Because it's like being loyal to a map of the world. And well, the map's not working. Oh, I don't care about the hell with the world. I'm following the map. And then bonk right.
Right, and that's what a lot of Christians fall into, that sort of category.
Well, not just Christians. I mean, I know as many atheists who do it.
Oh yeah.
We all do that, right? We all find ourselves being beholden to our beliefs, and we make the mistake of thinking that there's a virtue in being loyal to your beliefs, and you should never be loyal to your beliefs. Like as soon as your beliefs cease to serve you, that is, cease to seem true, right? You should just just hold them at arm's length and go, well, I don't know if that's true anymore.
Right.
Agnostic about it, right?
Right. See, that's the problem though, because people around here, as I've tried to show many times before, they like to stick with their emotions. It's not so much a whole logic-based decision when it comes to half of these topics. So sometimes I try to break those barriers and really get down to the meat of this. And a lot of times it does tend to be the fact that they want to stick to their beliefs, and that mainly because it feels comfortable. Change is something that a lot of people don't necessarily like. They like to kind of stay within their own bubble because that's what they've known. That's what they've always, felt comfortable in or whatnot. And they really don't want to change that. And therefore, if they were to change, they'd have to give up, a lot of different things that they might not want to give up at the time. So, and again, some of these people have already changed once, right? If they went from Christian to being atheist, that's a change again. If they were to somehow find evidence or whatnot, or a convincing argument that makes it seem like God exists now, again, that's another painful change. And one of them's like, hey, I already went through a painful change, and I thought now I'm on the right side. I don't want to have to switch again, like that would kind of suck. And I think some people just, it's an emotional thing. Like, it's not comfortable. People are very much creatures of routine. And when we recognize that, I think that's where we can start to admit certain emotional flaws in that when it comes to our own reasoning and what we believe and what actually is true despite what we want to be true.
Well, I would agree with that, but I mean, with one caveat, you got to be a worry that I have as an atheist is I hear a lot of my fellow atheists assuming that as soon as someone is engaging in apologetics, that they're engaging in an intellectually dishonest enterprise, and that's not always true. There are bullshit artists out there that are just shilling for their religion, and they resort to any argument will do to get people to believe or to avoid an objection landing or something like that, right? And a lot of it is, as you said, is not so much trying to convince atheists as it is trying to make sure that the people who are already in the fold don't experience too much doubt and start questioning and stuff like that, and just sort of reassure them, no, don't, nothing to worry about here, right? And you just give them an apologetic that smooths their concern and eases their anxiety about a potential objection. That's true. That happens, but not all apologetics works that way. Not all apologetics is intellectually dishonest, right? If you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, it behooves you as a rational person to think through your political beliefs and see what undergirds them, what makes sense. You know, where are you deriving these political conclusions from? Which of your political views actually imply specific policy recommendations? Which of these policy recommendations actually work against one another and don't fit together or don't make any sense? You know, which ones work and which ones don't. I mean, we should all be engaged in this. And this is the practice of belief revision, right? We should all be involved in the practice of revision.
Yeah, I agree.
And there are lots of sincere believers that are doing that, and they get into apologetics not just to, oh shoot, I got stuck with an objection, I need to look up a counter argument. If they have real questions, and they really want to make sense. They want to reconcile, for instance, look, evolution seems to be true, and we live in an old universe, but the Bible, you know, tells this creation story that just doesn't square with that. How to make sense of it, right? Something's got to give, right? Something's got to give is what motivates anybody to engage in belief revision. And it's not a fault or a failing when people engage in apologetics, right? Those are the people trying to exercise their rationality. Now, there's some people that admittedly just, you know, they are dogmatists and they fall into the But my caution here is to all my fellow non-believers: don't assume that because someone is putting forward an apologetic or is an apologist that they're intellectually dishonest. That's just not fair, and it's just false to fact. It's often true, but I don't even know that it's mostly true.
So,
see, the only
you mentioned earlier about, say, why accept these particular ideas about God, like, you know, about whether or not he's omnipotent or whatever. I mean, if you read the rest of the Summa Theologiae, for example, I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas addresses omnipotence, God's knowledge, how we can speak about God, and all of these things. So I don't think that it's just that, and he derives this from what it is to be necessary being in itself.
Right. I'm not suggesting that it's willful. I'm not saying that people are just pulling this stuff out of their backsides, right? What I'm suggesting is that these are all stipulative definitions. They're not arbitrary, right? To say that something is stipulative, okay, is to say that a person has said it is this way. They can have reasons for thinking that it's that way, but they can't demonstrate that it's that way, okay? Because you've got, you know, another, and the proof of that is you've got another group of people, and they are deriving their definition of omnipotence and omniscience also from Scripture, right? And so there's a lot of proof texting that goes on. For instance, you know, you see it in, you know, City of God with St. Augustine, and in the Summa with St. Thomas Aquinas. You see it in the Proslogion of St. Anselm. We see it today. We see it in all systematic theology. Okay, so I'm not suggesting that people are willfully pulling stuff out of their backsides and inventing any old damn thing. Of course, what they are inventing and stipulating is constrained by something, but the something that it's constrained by is a pile of stories, right? And the stories contain mixtures of fact and fiction, right? This is not a good foundation for being confident that you've arrived at the right concept of omnipotence and the right concept of God, and so that you should believe it and affirm its existence, right? Much less organize your life around it.
But so when St. Thomas Aquinas does this, he has two parts, right? He has a first part where he does cite authorities like Scripture and St. Augustine and other people, and then he has a second part where he just has a pure rational proof. So I don't think it's the case. I mean, you point to, well, there's other interpretations. Well, Sure, but I mean, if we look at other things about the world, like there's other interpretations of quantum mechanics. That doesn't prove that there's no fact of the matter about what's actually going on there.
There's a fact of the matter about God's existence. He either exists or he doesn't exist. And if he exists, he's going to have a nature, and there will be features and attributes and properties about God, presumably. So there's a fact of the matter. So I'm not suggesting that there's a kind of indeterminacy about an ontological indeterminacy here. What I'm suggesting is that as a matter of doxastic responsibility, with respect to your responsibilities to yourself as a believer, as one who believes things, and we're all believers, we all believe things, right? Everyone has beliefs, right? A belief is just what you think is the case, right? You have a responsibility to make sure that your confidence scales with the quality and quantity of the evidence and reasons for what it is that you believe. There's two ways to be irrational. One way to be irrational is to just arrive at your conclusions in a stupid way. You don't use reason, you violate the norms of reason, you're not using induction and so forth. You're not relying on sensory evidence. And so there's all kinds of ways that you can run afoul, okay, and arrive at a conclusion. You can even arrive at the true conclusion and arrive at it all wrong, and it's still irrational. You might have arrived at a truth, but by completely unreliable means. It's still irrational of you to have arrived at your belief that way. But another way to be irrational, okay, is to, even if you've have good reasons for what you believe, to have your confidence out of step with the quality and quantity of the reasons. I mean, if the evidence is down here and the reason and the evidence are down here, and your confidence is way up here, there's something wrong. Similarly, if the evidence is overwhelmingly good, but you're not very, very confident, even though you're aware of the reasons and evidence, something's wrong. Right? We see both of those actually. Think of people who, in the face of overwhelming evidence, stubbornly refuse to believe what they ought to believe, given the understanding of the evidence that they seem to have.
Right.
So what I'm suggesting here is that if you look at cases where there's a discrepancy in a field like physics, okay, because you've got many interpretations of quantum phenomena, okay? How we do interpret these experiments and the data that we have. There's many different competing views. That doesn't mean that there isn't a fact of the matter about which one of these is right? Maybe all of them are wrong, right? They can't all be right, you know, but at least one of them could be right.
Okay.
But the fact, I'm trying to answer Achihuahua's point here. I know I'm wrong. I'm almost there. So the fact that there's a discrepancy doesn't show that there's no fact of the matter. What it shows, though, is that we don't have a reason to be as confident as we are. If some physicist says, "Look, it's this," it's the the Copenhagen interpretation. Okay, that's it. And insists that that's the way it is, as opposed to, well, this is one way it could be. Well, I think it's clear which one's the dogmatist and which one isn't, right? And that's the difficulty that I have with so much theology, is that the degree of confidence in the conclusions doesn't scale with the state of the evidence and the state of the reasons, right? I mean, people's confidence in their picture of God ought to be something so guarded. It ought to be something like, I think maybe, possibly, perhaps God might be like this. Here are my reasons, right? But they don't do that, right? And that's the difficulty I have. I don't have a problem with people speculating, accepting certain Bible stories as true. I mean, I do have a problem with people accepting certain things, but given that they accept certain facts as true within the Bible and they take them as historical, and they build up their theology out of that, I don't have a problem that they come up with something speculative. Okay, so, as I said, science starts with speculation. You speculate all over the place. The difficulty that I have is that people believe these things, and I don't just mean guardedly believe. I mean, they really believe, and they really get behind them, and they take on the force of dogma. Right? It's a dogma that God is all loving. You're not allowed to deny that God is all loving. And yet, it seems to me there's plenty of evidence that God is anything but, right? But then we have to kind of find a way around all those counterexamples.
Yeah, you have to use different definitions.
Yeah, you have to use a definition of love that doesn't correspond with anything that any of us mean by love.
Yeah.
I mean, if the God of the Old Testament is all loving, then the guy who comes home and beats his wife and kicks the dog is all loving too, right? That's the difficulty that I have, right?
Right. See, now grant that. I was going to say, we are, at least for me, I was going to say we're going to be wrapping up soon because I don't want to stay here all night. So I'm going to let everybody from left to right make their concluding statements. The original topic was you can only have objective morality with God. We did kind of go on to a little bit of things. So, Irenic, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, okay. Well, I wanted to maybe interact with Ozzy a little bit, but it seems to me that if you accept, yeah, okay. But yeah, I was just going to make a point maybe that it seems to me that it's possible that the Kalam argument gives you a foundation for a lot of those omnis, or maybe not omnis, but at least and if the universe came into existence and everything that comes into existence has a cause, then the cause behind the universe coming into existence, we can make some reasonable guesses as to the power. I mean, it's almost immense power, but we could say might be unimaginable power. I mean, whatever power that could make this universe just come into existence from a personal agent. So power into, like, by looking at the universe and seeing its order and the design and things, we can that might answer some questions about the intelligence behind such a being. So anyway, it's not just I mean, that's just one thing I was going to bring into the argument.
Multiple personality, do you have your final statements, if you're there?
Yeah, I'm here. I wish we would have been able to maybe flesh out a little bit more what this difference is between God, should be given credit for the good and not attribute responsibility for the bad for God. Because again, it seemed like it was an outcome-driven evaluation, that if the event's outcome was good, then in fact, God's, we attribute that to God. But if that outcome was bad, then we would just say it's not of God. So it seemed that we never really finished that conversation. But I'll say I had a very good talk, and hopefully next time we'll get into it.
Ouchie, your final thoughts?
So I guess I can address that real quick, because I didn't actually make that kind of a distinction. I made a distinction between what God directly causes and what God doesn't directly cause. So I wouldn't say that God is directly responsible for the evil that in the world, or directly responsible for the good in the world that is the result from, say, human will. I wouldn't say either of those. And then just to address what Ozzy was saying, I think that the reason you're coming to it from that perspective is because you think that our position is wrong. You think the position of theism is wrong, and I think that you don't see how all these different ideas are connecting logically, and you think, well, I think you're kind of making a story about how we come to this irrational belief, or this belief that's not confirmed by the evidence. And I think I probably make the same kind of idea in my mind about atheists as well. I think that, well, they haven't read enough St. Thomas Aquinas or something like that, right? And personally, I prefer to focus on the arguments. And I think that ultimately, if you look into it enough, this is my personal opinion, I think that you'll find that all of these different ideas about God can be justified.
Right. All right, Ozzy, your final thoughts?
I won't add it. You guys have let me do most of the talking, and that was very, very kind of you. So thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for watching.
Right. Cool. So one last thing I'll say is what I basically said in the beginning, because no one could hear me for some reason. So, morality. I mean, 'cause no one's really addressed what I had to say exactly. So I feel like, you know, humans in a sense, we're fascinated with, you know, what we call right and wrong. You know, even long ago, we had people discuss about how we can know if something is a good or a bad deed. Only issue is that all these assumptions are based on, well, our own opinions or the opinions of others. Either way, it was not really different types of morality we were discovering, but instead we were finding out what personally disgusts or what makes us feel good. What kind of morality is that, though? I mean, that doesn't sound like morality to me, but rather saying what we should do based on feelings and other people's feelings. However, you know, if we have a designer of the universe, whatnot, he created it to be a certain way. What he says morality or what he dictates as morality, that probably is a way better reflection of what's actually right and wrong than our own values. So thanks everybody for watching. This has been hosted by your boy Trill The Cyberspace Fay, the oneness community who reveals humans' true primitive nature and man's deepest and darkest desires. If you want more of these conversations, be sure to subscribe to the Great Debate Community channel. Also, the Great Debate Community Google Plus page might be a place you might want to go to or to post your own ideas for conversations, and you know, Google Hangouts might stem from there. Also, you might want to check out Steve McRae's channel. He's one who owns this Great Debate Community. You might want to subscribe if his type of content is your thing. Thanks everybody for watching, and peace out, y'all.